I genuinely did not even plan on making this video, but after Notcry, I'm just annoyed at how many people missed out on important events that affect both story and characters, specifically because those events happened 5 years ago. Events are a big part of the Genshin player experience, and just like every gacha out there, Genshin also has limited time events. These events serve one very important function, and that is obviously to incentivize the players to come back and play the game regularly. And to Genshin's credit, their new recollection feature and the permanent event quests that they added recently for majorly important events like the Sunspray Summer Resort and the 2026 Lantern Rite gives me more motivation to talk about why they just need to bring back the older events, because they are incredibly important to Genshin's storytelling. And while there have been some misses when it comes to these events, a lot of them are actually the best content that the game has to offer, apart from the Archon quests and the world quests. Story quests, some are really good, but in my opinion, this might be controversial. Some of the events actually give a lot more insights to a lot of the 5 stars than their own story quests ever did. So in my opinion, right now Genshin is in a bit of an awkward spot when it comes to their event storytelling. We have the very large, inaccessible library of lore, world building, and character development, but at least as of recent, the more recent events are available for more cohesive storytelling. Not all events, but some of the important ones. So today, I'm going to be recapping the quests that I think are extremely crucial for us to play through as players. And of course, I'm going to talk about the implications of having these events being time limited and what it does to the story overall, aka the consequences of Genshin's fragmented storytelling. Some disclaimers as usual. I actually started playing this goddamn game in patch 1.0 and I have played through all of the flagship events, even through some burnout patches. I've powered through them. So therefore, my opinion on what is memorable or enjoyable can be different from yours. The events that I will be discussing are the ones that I feel adds to Genshin's fragmented storytelling problem. I will try to structure this video as the following. The first one is how fragmentation occurs in the lore and world building, and then in the development of the characters, and lastly in the environmental storytelling. Also, as usual, I am not a professional YouTuber. I'm just here to yap, and this video is barely scripted, so don't say I didn't warn you. I have always found it amusing that one of the very first events that Genshin had turned out to be foundational to the game's lore, which is, the false sky. And it is inaccessible to probably 90% of the active player base because it was released in November of 2020, well over 5 years ago. If you had picked up the game just 2 months after its release, you would have still missed this event. That's how early this was. Other than the false sky, Unreconciled Stars also introduced Scaramouche. Is it completely disastrous to have missed this event? It's definitely not the most crucial event in the story. The game does touch on the false sky lore as the Archon quest progresses, but it is still a different experience for the people who were early enough to experience this event. And I think if you've played the game enough to get all the way to Natlan, where the false sky starts to become integrated into the main story or Archon quests, you've probably already heard about the theory of the false sky before you even got to Natlan. But this event being limited to 5 years ago now completely robs newer players of that foreshadowing moment. Imagine if you had just picked up the game and as early as Mondstadt or Liyue, you're told by this harbinger that the sky in Teyvat is fake without any context whatsoever. It was just a very intriguing way to introduce something that would eventually become one of the biggest plot twists or reveals in the game. It would naturally just impact the player's experience when the fake sky is finally fully incorporated into the story. I'm pretty lucky that I've been able to experience the Unreconciled Stars event, so when the fake sky is finally in the main story, the payoff of essentially just waiting for years on end to see where that storyline was headed was actually pretty cool. For me, it felt almost like a reminder of how far we've come in the game and in the story. Like, we have gotten through 4 to 5 regions just to get to this moment. I still remember the old Scaramouche is a flat earther memes back in the day because most people just didn't know what he meant by the sky being fake. I mean, some people eventually figured it out, But for the more casual players, they were probably just confused. And considering how that piece of information turned out to be foundational to the game's story even to this day, like, it's so central to the story that the Not Cry Archon quest was about how Columbina needed to go back to the moon, which lies outside of Tevat's false sky. The false sky being revealed in 1.1 just makes a completely different experience than having it just suddenly be central to the story, seemingly out of nowhere. Like, yes, it was mentioned here and there, but again, different experience, different impact. With Unreconciled Stars, it feels like a haunting mystery that follows the traveler in their journey through Tevat from the beginning, like from Mondstadt, and then that mystery gets revealed later on rather than it just being another piece of lore that's stated as a fact during the main quest. Also, the fact that in Unreconciled Stars, Scaramouche was actually tasked by the Jester to investigate the meteorites also reveals just how much the Fatui know about the truth of the world or Tevat. It's information that is so mind-boggling that even someone like Scaramouche said that he had wished the Jester gave him a warning before exposing him to the truth. It is a key piece of lore and world building that is just lost to time. Another piece of important world building lore that's just scattered throughout these events is actually the one about the Hexen Circle. I believe they were first officially mentioned in the second Windbloom Festival. We always knew and heard of Gold, Alice, and Mona's master all being friends, but they were never like tied to an official group until the Hexen Circle was revealed during the Windbloom Festival. This coven of mages has also expanded as it reveals more of its members, and you guessed it, a lot of it are also through time-limited events. The biggest example of this is Anders' daughter, who is also the creator of Durin, the character, not the dragon, who is never truly in the game, but her presence is most felt in the Simulanka summer event, which we will get to, and also in Durin's story quest. But my point is, she was mentioned quite a lot and is quite central during the Simulanka event, even without her being an actual character. You know, kind of like how Gold is central to a lot of the events that happen in Tevat, but she's never really there. The Hexen Circle's presence in the game story is just that powerful. Speaking of Gold, even someone as prominent as her was also first really touched on in the story during Albedo's event, all the way back during the first and second Dragonspine events. And this event is also incredibly important because it sets the foundation for the horde of abyssal creatures that we meet later on in the game. This was the players' first exposure to Gold's creations and the destructive force that she had created with her alchemy, all of which are of course incredibly important not only to develop Gold's character as a potential future villain, but also to the world building of Tevat in general. The abyssal creatures are everywhere and are a constant presence in the main story itself, so the game having an event establishing how Kemia works, which is how most of these creatures are created, and they are also the main monsters that ravaged Tevat 500 years ago during the Cataclysm, and they are created by one person using one form of alchemy. Also, if you didn't know, Scaramouche, the puppet, was actually created using a technique that A learned from a Conrian. So the technique that she used to create artificial life stemmed from Kemia, the same alchemy that Gold uses. So understanding both the power and destructive nature of Kemia is incredibly important to Genshin's world building. Therefore, having a piece of Gold's lore just missing will always impact the world building. And that's the thing with the Hexen Circle. They're also involved in the world of Tevat, yet a lot of the lore is just scattered in different events. And if you've missed those events, you will just have to go through that extra effort of looking through the Genshin wiki or watching previous events on YouTube, which as players is just not that fun. Let's admit it. The solution is there, like you can do it. You can go on YouTube, you can look up the cutscenes, but it is not an ideal experience. I also want to mention the Moonchase Festival in this section because while it does mainly affect Goba, and missing this event would mean that you've missed missed out on Goba's lore, like all of it. Like his entire lore is just locked behind this event, which in itself is a crime. And through that, you would also be missing just a key piece of Liyue's history that was shaped by this character, who is probably on your team at some point. Knowing just how much Goba had sacrificed to save the people of Liyue also adds an emotional layer to the story other than just adding more lore and world building. And to this day, like I still see the effects of that story in Liyue whenever I go to Liyue. It just makes the world feel more alive because you have that emotional layer that was shown during the story. I think I would be complaining about the 2026 Lantern Rite if it wasn't permanent, because through that event, Zibai's lore is also very crucial to Liyue's history. And like Istaroth is getting the exact same treatment as the Hexen Circle, in which she is just mentioned over and over again without actually being present, and it happens in events. But at least for now, the events are permanent, so I'm not gonna complain too much about that, but the effects are still the same. But if the newer events are time gated, like the older ones, we would also be missing a very big part of the world's story, of Teyvat's story, and also another important character that directly affects how the world works. While the flagship events do affect the world building of Teyvat, a lot of the heavy lifting can still come from world quests. However, I can't always say the same for how the characters are developed or even established within the story. Obviously, we have the story quests and some have been better than others, but there are also events that does a lot more for these characters than their own story quest ever did. I think the easiest example is Albedo. I think most people don't even remember Albedo's story quest, and instead they will always remember the first two Dragonspine events that he was a central character in. You know, the event that gives you Festering Desire and his signature weapon for free. Shadows Amid Snowstorms in particular is just such a special event. I feel like it had a great cast of Mondstadt characters, a mystery that wasn't really resolved cleanly, you know, to leave you with some of that intrigue and suspense, and also a good chunk of lore about how the artificial life that was created by Kemiya would function, and of course, extremely cool character moments for literally the entire cast. It was such a banger event, and it did so much for Albedo as a character. What's funny is that in my personal experience, my friends who started Genshin way after patch 2.2 just never understood why I loved Albedo so much and why I think he is so interesting as a character, and they definitely did not understand why for the longest time people kept tying Albedo's presence with massive lore bombs, and that is because he dropped massive lore bombs at every single winter event that he was a part of. So people were really excited when he returned years later in Paralogism, which is an interlude quest, so it's not limited, but the central focus of that interlude quest is heavily tied to Kemiya and Albedo and, you know, like Gold. And as I said in the world building section of this video, the concept of Kemiya itself is mostly explored within time limited events. To make it even worse, this quest in particular explores the birth or rebirth of Durin, the character. A literal 5 stars lore and character story is locked behind multiple flagship events. So to even fully understand Durin's story, we would first have to understand the full extent of Durin the Dragon story, which mostly takes place in the first Dragonspine event, you know, the Chalk Prince event. And then afterwards, we have to at least have an idea or understanding how Kemiya and the creation of artificial life works, which happens in the second Dragonspine event. And then you would have to have an idea of who the Hexen Circle are, which were officially established in the second Windbloom Festival. And then you would have to play through Simulanka to see why we have an entirely different Durin than the one we got in Dragonspine. See, one of the Hexen Circle's members, M, saw that Durin the Dragon's fate was so tragic, she wanted to just give him another chance in her own story. So she wrote Durin the character into a story with a different outcome. And then Durin the character is reborn and is given a human form in the interlude quest. That is a botched recap of Durin's lore, but that's the gist of it. That is like, what, 4 time limited events that you have to personally play through in order to experience the full lore of this one character. If you missed these events, does it automatically make Durin the character unappealing or unplayable? No, I think he has a really good story quest that does its job. So you do get some recollection of the story, but it is a world's difference than what the initial build-up for his character is actually like. And then they just keep giving you these like screenshots and like a screen of like the summary of Simulanka and paralogism, and it is so annoying to me, especially considering how central Durin has become in more recent quests like in Not Cry, for example, and just how much of a fun presence he is in Mondstadt. He even forms this friendship with the Wanderer, who is also heavily impacted by the fragmented storytelling. As we all know, he was introduced in the Unreconciled Stars event as Scaramouche, and it is still so funny to me how important he is to the story to this day. He was introduced in 1.1 and he just keeps showing up in every region. I think he has one of the most consistent appearances throughout the story. He was in Unreconciled Stars, he was in Inazuma briefly, he had an entire event centered around his lore, which is the Irodori Festival that mostly talked about his link to Inazuma and the Raiden Gokaden, and then he was the main villain in Sumeru, and then he had an entire interlude quest, fully established him as a character, and then he took a bit of a backseat in Natlan, but he was still like in random events. Like I said, he was in Simulanka and then other Sumeru events, and most recently he's back in the main story in Not Cry, which is crazy to me. He's not even like a cameo, he is so important to the story. I've said this before, but his presence in events and the permanent quests have always been different. In Unreconciled Stars, his introduction as a harbinger felt a lot more impactful. He was there on a mission assigned by the Jester. He tried to play nice with the Traveler before trying to kill them, and then after learning the truth of the world and being slightly shaken by it, he decided to leave because the Traveler didn't really interest him anymore. As opposed to the 3-minute cameo that we got in Inazuma, which was a pretty underwhelming introduction of such an important character in my opinion. There are also events after his defeat in Sumeru that showcased his journey towards redemption. I've also said before that Scaramouche wasn't redeemed in the interlude quest where he erased himself from Ermintel. If anything, I've always felt like his redemption story has only begun with that quest. We got to see him assimilating into life within the academia in the Interdarshan event. We get to see him do good and be the hero in Simulanka and forming a bond with Durin, which is a plot point that will be very confusing for players who just finished Not Cry but never got to experience Simulanka. By Not Cry, Durin and the Wanderer are just best friends, which doesn't have a lot of explanation. Those are vital character moments that are just missing from the game's permanent story, and it affects player experience. It doesn't make the game unplayable, but it does make the story and experience fragmented. This isn't exclusive to Scaramouche and Albedo, of course. There are plenty of characters that fall victim to this. At the top of my mind, there's the cast of the second Golden Apple Archipelago event. Kazuha actually has his entire backstory, one that predates losing his best friend, being shown in this event. We actually get to see glimpses of the fall of the Kaedehara clan, and also how Kazuha was able to ultimately come to terms with it during a summertime odyssey. Kazuha also gets another moment of character development during the Irodori Festival, where it was established that Scaramouche was directly responsible for the fall of the Raiden Gokaden, and therefore he was also responsible for basically ruining the Kaedehara clan. But other than that, we also got moments where the game just shows how Kazuha absolutely holds no grudges, in the way that he was able to forgive Kujosara, who was the person that sealed his friend's fate. This interaction really speaks volumes on who Kazuha is as a character, and it's also something that's just missing from the main Inazuma Archon quest. And Fischl is also a character that I feel like is heavily overshadowed in the main quests, but shines in events. Her friendship with Mona was formed in Unreconciled Stars, and then they were reunited in A Summertime Odyssey. They really dove deep into her character and the loneliness within her. She was faced with her own insecurities and was forced to face them head on during the event, and it was one of those moments where I feel like a character that I've been familiar with for so long has finally gotten their moment to shine and was finally established, like fully established as a character, which is actually the same feeling that I get during the Lantern Ride quests, especially Hu Tao. I was was always a big fan of Hu Tao, and I have always been annoyed that her story quest didn't really explore who she is as a person and as a character, but instead was more focused on the role of the Wangsheng funeral parlor director, which is also important because it is her job. But I was so dissatisfied by it, I actually made a video about Hu Tao a few years back, and I really do feel like the 2025 Lantern Rite was a more fitting story quest for her. Like, it did so much for her as a character. There are plenty of characters that will just never get the chance to shine again the way that they did in these events. Like, for example, Gaming. I think he had a fantastic Lantern Rite quest, but it is, again, time-gated. There's a whole story about Guizhong, who's very important to Madame Ping and also Zhongli. That's also locked in an event. And did you know Child was in Inazuma hunting down Scaramouche after he ran off with the Electronosis post Inazuma? That was so random and honestly also really fun because there was just no follow-up to that storyline for a while after the Inazuma Archon quest was concluded. Okay, the next one I'm gonna talk about is mostly about the visual storytelling that is just lost to time or to YouTube videos because of how a lot of the sets that were used in the events are just not accessible anymore. Obviously, the biggest perpetrator for this are the summer events. Each summer event set was just so magical. It had lore built into it, like remember the first Magu Kenki that was found in the Golden Apple Archipelago? Yeah, that had lore that's tied to the disaster that went on in Seirai Island in Inazuma and how Akodomeki ended up in the Golden Apple in the first place. That is just such a cool example of how detailed Genshin's world building is, and a big narrative value that comes from media like video games is being able to experience that story firsthand. The second summer event, I think, did this even better. I already mentioned Kazuha's backstory being explored and fully established in this event, but the way Genshin did it visually with the individual domains for the main cast of the event was just incredible. We got to see like a replica of Kazuha's home growing up. We got to see silhouettes of him and his dad's conversation as their family deteriorated. It was both a gripping narrative and also really good visual storytelling going on at the same time, which is a really good player experience in general. That is why we love video games. At least that's why I love video games. The level of immersion and storytelling that's achievable through video games is just so different from any other media, which is why when I see people say like, well, you can just look up the old events on YouTube. Sure, you can, but it's just different from playing through it and experiencing it firsthand. I get that's the practical solution and the only solution that we have right now, and it's better than not knowing the story at all, but it's just not as enjoyable, which is again why I'm really happy that they seem to be working on features in making important events permanent for newer players to experience. The other characters' domains in A Summertime Odyssey are also really incredible. Fischl is a favorite of mine. It was beautiful and the design had so much character. It really visualized the world that she constructed to battle her own loneliness and insecurities. I mean, we can read Fischl's backstory and we've all heard her crazy monologues in the game, but to see that imaginary world come to life is just on another level. We also got Mona and Xinyan's domain, which are both really gorgeous and fun to experience also. And another summer event that I will mention is Simulanka and its storybook themed world. I loved that world. Not gonna lie, I was a bit on a Genshin burnout during the event, but I did still play through the entire thing and I just loved the world design. It was so whimsical and endearing, and of course it was the birthplace of Durin, as we talked about. We even have the evil dragon version of Durin in Simulanka. I think Genshin did a good job in incorporating the storybook vibes into this world and made the experience so unique for the players. Please Hoyo, just bring this event back for newer players. Like, if I had to pick one event or a series of events to become permanent, I think I would vote the summer events. I know I just mentioned like 3, but I think all of the summer events have been really fun. They are just always the most memorable, and somehow they also have important lore in them. But I will say that it's a shame that a lot of players will never see how Inazuma was decorated for the Iridori Festival, and some of the different yearly decorations for Liyue's Lantern Rite, and also the Hexen Circle like tea party set that was set up in Mondstadt for the second Windbloom Festival. Even though these are on a smaller scale compared to the entire new areas and regions that we got for the summer events, I still think they added visual narrative value onto the game. So in conclusion, I really just hope that Genshin does eventually make it optional for players to experience these events without rewards. They're definitely going in the right direction direction with how they're treating the most recent events and making them permanent. So maybe they'll give a chance for newer players to experience the older ones too. Again, I don't think this is necessary for all players, but for those who play the game because they love the story and the characters and really want to experience the game's story at its fullest, I think they should be given the option to do that, especially when so many of these events are just really great and does so much for the characters themselves. I think if we didn't have the winter dragonspine events, no one would have pulled for Albedo. I'm sorry, I like his design, I think he's great. My first ever unlisted YouTube video was about how much I regretted not pulling for Albedo during his first banner, but without his events, all we had was his sorry excuse for story quest. Also, like, if the game is gonna reference these older events, at the very least, make them replayable. The most recent example is the Diluc and Kea banter about the ice bridges that they made in the Golden Apple 5 years ago in the first summer event. I was both amused and annoyed at how I got that joke, but most of my friends probably didn't. It probably went over their heads because it's such an old reference. It would be the same thing as going to the Wanderer and saying, hey, remember the day that you investigated that meteorite and called the sky fake? I don't know, unless you like the feeling of having that exclusive Genshin experience because you started the game when it launched, I think you would want newer players to be able to experience older events. Because personally, I was exhausted of having to explain why I love Albedo for over 4 years until Paralogism came out not too long ago. But yeah, that's all I have to say for now. Let me know what you think about this topic. I'm sorry if this is very all over the place. I didn't really have a script on hand. I just wrote out my thoughts and recorded and hope for the best. I know I've talked about this before, but I think this is still such a relevant issue in the game now more than ever, especially after Durin, and I'm happy that Genshin seems to be going in the right direction. So Hoyo, please keep doing what you're doing, and yeah, I hope everyone's having a nice day. Thank you for listening and for watching. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing and know that I appreciate you all so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.